All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. We're here tonight for another exciting meeting of the Slavery Archive Book Club, hashtag Slavery Archive. I'm here with co-founders of hashtag Slavery Archive and Slavery Archive Book Club, Jessica Marie Johnson, who's at Johns Hopkins University, and Ana Lucia Araujo. Did I say that correctly, Ana? I'll get there. I'll get there with my Portuguese pronunciations. At Howard University, and I am one of the co-conveners. I'm Vanessa Holden. I'm at the University of Kentucky. And then there's Alex Jill, who's at Columbia University, who will probably pop on and off of your screens a little bit later. Tonight, we're happy to kick off Women's History Month by featuring As If She Were Free, a collective biography of women and emancipation in the Americas. The volume is a collaborative effort that brought together scholars across historical fields, engaging across geographies, temporal bounds, and slaveries in the Atlantic world. We're joined today by the book's editors, Erica L. Ball, who's at Occidental College, Tatiana Seijas, who's at Rutgers University, and as a proud RU Mafia member, I'm happy to welcome someone from Rutgers tonight, and Terri L. Snyder at California State University, Fullerton. And rather than go into all of the many accolades I could give our wonderful editors tonight, I'm going to go ahead and put their institutional websites in the chat. So if you'd like to check out more about them individually so that we can get right to the good stuff, because I'm sure, especially across 25 different biographical entries and essays tonight, and some of our contributors even joining us, we're going to want to get right into the discussion. So go ahead and check them out online. I'm going to go ahead and pass it over right now to Tatiana Seijas, who will begin with presenting what the editors have for us to begin thinking about tonight. When they are done presenting for a very short time on the collection itself, please submit your questions by going down to the little reactions button on your screen. It has a little smiley face with a plus sign. When you click on it, you'll see that there is an option to raise hand. Myself, Ana Lucia, and Jessica will do our best to keep up with you, but that's probably the best way to keep track of who wants to be in the queue to ask questions. If you're joining us on YouTube, feel free to put your question in the chat, and one of us will make sure that your question ends up here and is engaged by the authors who are out there and our editors. And with that, Tatiana, why don't you go ahead and get us started?
Well, hello, everybody. Good afternoon. We're all thrilled to be here. I wanted to begin by thanking you for bringing us on to the book club. And I wanted to give a big shout out to Ana Lucia, who wrote a wonderful blurb for a book. But more than that, Ana Lucia was one of the first people who supported our effort. So thank you, Ana Lucia, for this and for all that you do for women historians around the world. So that was how we wanted to begin. And I turn it over to Erica.
Okay, thank you for passing the baton this way, Tatiana. And I also want to echo your thanks. It really is an honor to be here with this wonderful group and have this conversation. So thank you all. I thought I would kick things off just by talking a little bit about how Terri and Tatiana and I first began working together. It may be slightly unusual because Tatiana and I have never actually met like face to face in person. All of our interactions have been virtual through Zoom or Skype or some other sort of, or email, right? But we first began working together because we were having separate conversations with Terri. Terri and I had worked together for a while at the same institution, Cal State Fullerton, and we were having a set of conversations about about enslaved women or formerly enslaved women, and processes of emancipation, and Tatiana and Terri were also having a set of conversations in a different space. Is that right, Tatiana, Terri?
That's right.
Mhm. Yeah. And so the project really it grew organically, I would say, out of these early kinds of conversations with each other. And the more conversations we had, the more we decided that we wanted to try to turn our musings into something that could go thunk on the table, as a friend says, but turn it into a book. So that's really how the project began. I would say we were all interested in pursuing a set of questions, and we had similar sets of goals, but perhaps we might talk a bit about what each of us was hoping to achieve. I'll pass the baton to Terri.
Thank you, Erica. And thanks to all of the organizers for inviting us. This is really an honor. So in our conversations as we came together, I think all of us were reading widely. I was reading widely in early North American history, and there was new work that was emerging that was really kind of invigorating the project of biography. I think of Erica Armstrong Dunbar or Marissa Fuentes, historians who use really fragments of enslaved women's lives to be able to create a larger portrait of them. And as the three of us came together and talked, we were really intrigued by the project of biography. We were all working on different kinds of biographies, and we settled on that as a form. And we also brought in scholars who were also working with fragmentary evidence to reconstruct the lives of the enslaved and formerly enslaved women. We found at some point through noodling around on the web that a collective biography is actually a very old form for discussing or talking about or presenting women's lives. I think most recently in Vanguard, Martha Jones writes about Hallie Quinn Brown's Homespun Heroines as an early 20th century example of this genre. And that appealed to us because the idea of a collective biography was not to just present 24 different chapters, but to present 24 chapters that spoke to one another, right? That examined women's lives across hemispheric, national, and temporal boundaries, but actually were engaged in similar kinds of reconstructions and using biography from I think, a feminist viewpoint. So that we really wanted for the readers and for authors, and probably for ourselves, for the chapters to speak to one another. And collective biography seemed to be I think the best way of doing it. And also, again, I would say a reinvigorated from a feminist viewpoint, a way of doing history. And I think I'll turn it back over to Tatiana for a moment.
Okay. So I think we all came into this project with different agendas, as much as we have our commonalities in our intellectual work and interests. I certainly had a little bit of a political agenda, which was to include in our collection the work of historians who are not working in the United States, like Maria Elena, who's here with us, and also to do hemispheric history, to think about the experience of African descended people across the Americas, and to do so from a longue durée perspective, way before 1619, to really consider the lives of African people from the moment that they arrived in the Americas, arguably around 1498. And so this effort has grown from my own reading. I specialize in the 17th century, and I mostly work on Mexico and the Philippines. But I have kind of grown intellectually from a tradition of being a Latin Americanist, right? Trained by Stuart here, who's I think in the audience, to think about the experience of enslaved people beyond our usual kind of regional divides of people who really do the US, or people who really are only Mexicanists, or people who are Brazilianists. And in my wide ranging reading, I wanted to all of us to be in one place and think about all of the commonalities. So that's been kind of my get-go, to think in the long duration and to think across the whole continent. Terri? Oh, I'm sorry, Erica.
Okay, thank you, Tatiana. And I would just add that, like Tatiana and Terri, I was also interested in, intrigued and excited about working on a project that was hemispheric in scope and ranged widely in terms of time frame, temporality, and interested in deepening my work in biography. But I would add to the mix that the question of, it's a big question, but what does freedom mean? What might freedom mean? Was something that was gnawing at me, and I think gnawing at all of us. I mean, as we know, for example, right, that slavery was a deeply gendered phenomenon. It was gendered in terms of the ways in which it was experienced by the enslaved. Scholars have done terrific work showing that over the last few decades, but also the institution itself was a gendered institution insofar as the engine for the perpetuation of the institution rested in the wombs of women. Right? So since we know that is the case, the question then became, well, then in what way might the experience of freedom, the experience of emancipation, the quest for emancipation, might that also be a gendered phenomenon? We know that scholars have been doing wonderful work getting at the gendered experience of emancipation, the ways in which it was fraught, the ways in which it was a battle on the ground. But we thought it would be exciting to have this conversation, make it a hemispheric one, and kind of look over the long stretch of time to see what sort of patterns emerged, and how perhaps women's experiences might have differed from those of men. And to get at that, as we worked with our authors, and to also create some more coherence across the many chapters and many biographies, we asked each of our authors to really sit with and wrestle with 5 questions as they worked on their pieces. And those questions were, how did your subject claim freedom? What was her route to freedom? What obstacles did she face? What were the gender dimensions of claiming freedom? And then the big one, what is freedom? And we engaged those questions over a set of conferences. We each had the opportunity to work with authors at panels at the AHA and the OAH and the Western Association of Women Historians, and work through those questions. And we met with our authors on Skype. Each of us had a series of conversations. So we ended up having this what we think of as a radically collaborative project, really centered on these big questions. And we have 24 biographies, 25 we count the mini biography of Elizabeth Catlett that kicks off the volume, that wrestle with these questions across time and across space. So at this point, I think I would like to maybe open it up a little bit and hear and ask our authors. Several of our authors are here, and ask them to weigh in and talk a bit about either about their specific chapters, the lives of their subjects, and how they found how their subjects articulated and claimed freedom, or the process of working together, or anything else they would like to discuss. So I know I don't want to call on people like we're in class, but it's an open invitation.
So many beautiful faces, and you guys all saw the poster that we put together of all of our authors around the book cover, and now I see you, Margaret and Sophie, and so many of you. I just wanted to say really fast how happy I am that we completed this, and what a joy it is to see your faces, even though it's on the screen. So, I know not to call on anybody, but
so if you're one of the contributors and you want to just hop in, we're going to do our best to find you and keep you spotlit for the time that you're speaking. So go ahead and hop on in.
I think I will go. I may not stay for long. Hi, Vanessa. How are you?
Hey there.
Hey. So basically, one day I received an email, like you receive many emails in the morning. And I was like, what is that? And then I was like, oh, that seems very kind of a cool project. And I have many things to do, but I just love to multitask. So let's try to talk about Lumina Sophie, also known as Surprise. And basically, I was laughing because I'm not trained as a historian, but basically, I'm writing historical books or history books without knowing it. I was trained as someone doing literature, but because I'm from the Caribbean, from Martinique, and I've been interested in literature, connected in the space, but what people did. So I have to look at archives in different ways. That's why I really enjoyed this project. And I really love to have our session. I think it was a Zoom session or a Skype session. I cannot remember. It was just nice. I've never done that before. And, and see faces, because we received emails and talk. And they were demanding. They were hard. And I liked it. Because then I could see how me, from my tiny French space, I could connect with other authors. And literally, this project for me was like thinking about Edouard Glissant's relation, of a relation, how you just spread all over the Americas, and how to see the same desire for self-affirmation or freedom existed in different spaces, but could not be enacted in the same way. So the women I'm talking about is really a kind of representative of the afterlives of slavery, because she was an insurgent woman during 1870, the insurrection of southern part of Martinique. And at that time, people were afraid that slavery will come back again. And it was abolished for a second time in 1848 in Martinique. So it was really great for me to show how in a small island, people will try, or women will try to think about what it means to be free, to support their men, but at the same time, their men will also tell them, hey, remember, where's your space? Like, you can be behind us, but you cannot be in front of us. And yet those women were deported, and some of them were, like maimed and killed too. So I really enjoyed this project, and I've learned a lot looking at some of the archives, how the court records are very important. Not about what's said, but in between the lines, how to read, and how Black women were already angry at that time. It was just amazing to even have Black witness, Black men saying, oh, she pushed me. Oh, she's a bad woman. She's always yelling at people. And I'm like, yeah, well, it's what we do. What is wrong with that? And then, talking to them, and I remember, them challenging me, asking me, oh, well, but, what happened to Lumina Sophie when she was deported in, not New Caledonia, when she was deported in, I can't even think about it. Well, it will come back to me in 1 second. And I had to think about this and look about different things to make a point about the French state, about colonial elements in French. So I'm really happy to be a part. French Guiana. I don't know how I forgot that because it's a part of the French department. Anyway, so I'm just really happy to be here. I may have to jet off to go and teach a class. So annoying that teaching has to go in the way of your fabulousness, but hey, I need to get that money. So that was my little contribution, and I'm just looking forward to hearing from other writers. I hope they enjoyed the process the way I did. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Neem. Thanks for joining us. And thanks for keeping it real as you jet off to teach a class. Any other contributors want to talk about their experience with the volume?
Okay, I will.
Okay, great.
So, okay, thank you everybody for the event. Thank you to Ana Lúcia Araújo, my dear friend, who made the connection between me, Terri, and Tatiana, and Erica. And I'll say a few words about my happiness to be able to, sorry, the light is bad over here. To be able to tell the story of this mixed race novelist living very far away in the Amazon, in the Maranhão province, who never went to school, was an illegitimate child from unmarried parents. Her father was Black, her mother was white, I think. That's the most comprehensible situation to understand her life. She never went to school, and she became a novelist, who was the first Black woman in Brazil to publish a book, and a book which portrayed slave men and women as persons, a person with subjectivity, who were able to think about their lives, the situation of slavery, who can think about the homeland, who was able to, there's a long time that I don't speak English, sorry for that, who were able to detach themselves for the situation, the momentaneous situation, to think in the long range. So she was the first person who gave herself the liberty to think the slaves as persons, as a person who can understand the world and think about themselves. That has such a greatness. She was able to do something so incredible, futuristic, that she was forgot for more than a century. After the 70s, she started to be recognized for small circles as an important novelist in the Brazilian literature. And today she is very well known, I can say, but at the same time, it's very difficult. As she became an icon, it's difficult to put all the different aspects of her life together, because being mixed in Brazilian society is something completely different as in US society, as you know. It's difficult to understand how she dealt with all the ambiguities of her life. She was very lonely. She never married, and was very interesting that reading her diary, which is the first diary from a woman published in Brazil, you can understand that she developed attachment, love, passion for female friends. So I tried in very short text put together all these ambiguities and difficulties of the life of Maria Firmina dos Reis, who is a great, great person, great woman who can be in the future considered as someone maybe in America, the first one, the first Black woman to write about the subjectivity of the slaves, who allowed herself to think theater, who is similar to her, but she was not slave. So she was a novelist, but she was able to construct a character who has subjectivity. That was the great quality of her prose. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and ask, we have one more brave contributor before we move on to questions for people who have joined us. We want to make sure we have time for everybody to ask questions we want to ask.
Vanessa?
Yes.
I'm just gonna, I was a contributor, and I just wanted to say that one of the things that was so beautiful for doing this was working with Tatiana and Erica and Terri. I mean, this was like a real feminist collaboration, you know, and I there's lots of times that it could have gone off the rails, and really, I think what kept everybody there was just their encouragement and their just vision, you know, that this is something. And collaborative work is not easy, right? So I think we all just need to realize how much of a gift this this project was, and maybe as a model for future work. It's to me, it's just like true feminist biography. Just it's a biography of itself, right? Like how the book was actually made. So I just wanted to say that.
Thank you. And that segues right into a question that I have for our editors while we're waiting for folks. So folks, go ahead and start raising your hands, get in the queue. I'm going to ask a quick question to hopefully set everybody up so you have a little bit of time and kind of collect your thoughts on what you want to ask our editors. And if you note contributors out there that you want to chat with, you can also ask them questions too. So I have a question about exactly what Michelle was just talking about, the collaborative work that's happening here. I reviewed this collection for Black Perspectives. And I remember getting my copy of the book and thinking, how the heck did they pull this off? Like, what? Have they been working on this for like 40 years? How did this happen? Right. And I know that, you know, we have the magic of the internet and we can talk on Zoom and whatnot, but like, you know, historians can be a wily bunch to corral and to shepherd towards deadlines, word counts, citation practices, you know, these sorts of things. So beyond the questions, you know, you note that in your introduction that you gave authors these questions, but of course, across the many ways you can define historical fields, there are very different ways to answer a question about freedom. There are very different ways to answer a question about womanhood. There are different ways to answer a question about gender. So I want to ask, the behind the scenes, true life, real historians of collective work question about how to foster this kind of collaboration. I know myself as I've benefited immensely from collaborative work and doing collaborative work. And so I wonder, what best practices as editors of this really magnificent project you could share with everybody joining us tonight when it comes to really shaping and then corralling and completing a collaborative project like this.
I'll start if that's okay. I would say one thing that I think we all shared was that we ourselves, although we all were doing our own work and we had our own projects and we had our own ideas of what freedom might be, right? And certainly what freedom was for the subjects we were working with over here, we were very open to the possibilities. So from the get-go, I don't think that it was important to us to let the authors answer the questions in the way that was right for their subjects, because one of the things that was always sitting oddly with us about how freedom and emancipation is often talked about is that it can sometimes be, not for everyone, but sometimes be narrow, independence, land ownership, access to the vote, right? And we were open to whatever possibilities that our authors might find. So from the get-go, I think that openness allowed the pieces to take the shape and the form that they needed to take. And those were different. What we end up seeing, if we look at the book as a whole, is a really capacious interpretation of what freedom might mean. There are a variety of routes and possibilities, but again, the questions kind of held it together, even though our openness allowed authors to go in different directions. So I'll start there, and I'll ask Terri and Tatiana to jump in and build on that.
Should I go next? I'll go next. I'll back it up before that. I think one of the things that worked for us is that the three of us work in different historical time periods and fields. And so that we each of us in our own field, British early America for me, for instance, we knew people who could contribute to this project, who were working on projects that focused on biography, focused on women, focused on the idea of claiming freedom through a variety of ways. And I think we complemented each other. And also this project grew over time. We had many conversations, but in a compressed period. I think from the initial contact to the authors to the finished book was 3 years, is that right? And I think the big thing that worked for us, of course, is getting the press to understand the project. And that took several tries as well. People were like, you want to do a handbook, right? They didn't quite get, and I think it took us a while to formulate it. In the process of talking to various editors, working out, that helped us work out our vision too. But Cambridge seemed, I think, to really get on board with what we wanted to do. And then once that contract was in hand, we just pushed people. We said, here's the timeline, and we were flexible, but flexible within a month range, I think, for everybody. And I mean, I remember one time the three of us were Skyping, and Tatiana said, this book is going to go to the press in October. And Eric and I just kind of looked at each other on Skype like, is that possible? And it turns out, yeah, it was, with the authors, with sort of what the three of us could bring to it at different times, and with a very clear timeline, it worked out. So I would say your collaborators, but also your press and keeping to the timeline was helpful. It made it clear to everyone, I think, what we were trying to accomplish.
Well, I'll say that it does take like a force of will, a leap of faith that it can happen. And I think it also helped, and here is like a call out to friendship, that many of us called on our friends because they are great historians, but also because we knew them intellectually and we knew that they would come on board to help us build this, right? And I think that was somewhat of a feminist decision to reach out to women historians that we admire, but that we also love as people, you know. And I think that that also made it possible for us to be as demanding as we were sometimes, because we knew that we would be forgiven. And we also, I think, did a lot of reminding and encouraging individual authors to think about the larger collective, like what it is that we were actually doing together, to think of as collective biography as almost a story of one person, the one story of what it is to have experienced bondage, or to have been able to imagine bondage, you know, after abolition. And so that was also something that kept us together.
And I would add one more thing, just the conferences, I think also really helped to keep the project moving along, like keep us, allow us to adhere to our timeline, but also to just get in the habit of speaking to each other and meeting with each other and sharing with each other and bouncing ideas off of each other. So it was us and the authors working together with each other simultaneously throughout.
And can I add to that too? And the audiences at the conferences. I mean, AHA we did, which was this 2-part session, was amazing for the response that the project got. And that was really important as well. So that intellectual give and take was key.
Thank you. I know that, you know, a conversation about the collaborative nature of the work, you know, it'll continue throughout as we look at all different questions. So next up, Jessica Johnson has a question for y'all.
Hi, everybody. Congratulations on this amazing book. It's so phenomenal over here. It's so rich, and also congratulations on this amazing sisterhood and community that you guys have created. Like, I can tell even just in this conversation that it's like radiating warmth, and it just feels so good, especially in this time where we can't be around each other, but like I can tell there's a genuine bond here between these authors. So thank you for that. It's funny like that we ended on kind of the collectivity, but I actually was wondering if any of the contributors wanted to talk more about what kind of differences they saw between the different X. So it could be different archives, different timelines, different individual biographies, but is there anything that stuck out to any of the contributors? It's like, wow, like that is really striking how it went this way in this story, but went a different way in this other biography, or anything about the sources that might have really stuck out as you're building these biographies that really kind of diverge in particular ways, very based on place or time or empire. So just super broad about like, you know, the differences as also making part of this whole, to whoever wants to speak to that.
I don't mind jumping in, Jessica, if that's okay. I think mine was the second in the collection. Yeah, and I just really appreciated how the editors were allowed me to talk a little bit about that person I worked on, Paula de Eguiluz, in popular culture. That they really let that happen. I think that's so important, and I really kind of unloaded in that section, just sort of off the cuff in a way. So that was where I really appreciated having the freedom to kind of take a different approach, a more personal angle, and try to connect it to the present, because that's hard to do when you work so much in the 1600s, directly. And to have this particular figure become one of the most famous women in Spanish America in that time period, now it seems it's really fascinating process. So I'm really grateful that I could be a part of it, especially for that topic.
And if I might go into the conversation, especially with Nicole's article, because I normally work with the Inquisition and Inquisition cases, and her woman is one of the most famous women prosecuted for witchcraft in 17th century Cartagena. But in my case, I was looking at case of freedom or challenge or disputed freedom in 18th century Cartagena, Guaduas, that is close by Bogota in New Granada. So for me, one of the beauties of this project is that it was not only focused on prominent figures, but also on women that had many challenges arguing and claiming their freedom. So, and I think, like my case is New Granada, but you can see all of these differences between different geographies, and also in from the early conquest of the Americas to the 19th century, I guess, is the extension of the book. So yeah, I think being able to see different kinds of stories was one of the most powerful scope of this book, and the conferences as well. Thank you.
Thank you. So I see a question from Hope Calvert. You can unmute and go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, I'm actually curious, all the collaborators that have been a part of this project, has anyone come across enslaved that have dealt with homosexuality during this time period? I was just kind of curious about that. I have not read the book yet. I actually just found out about the book from my history professor. So I'm just curious to see if that's come up in anybody's archives.
Thank you. Great question.
Yeah, Hope, I have a case that's published in another great collaboration that I took part in, edited by Zeb Tortorisi, that deals with that topic. If you're interested, you can look up that one. It's about a priest who was soliciting in the confessional, and it mainly did involve younger men and enslaved people. So, and that's also, Zeb Tortorisi is also kind of, for Spanish America, he's kind of the go-to person for that topic. So I definitely look up anything from him.
And I hope Anna has put the name in the chat, so you can easily look it up.
That's helpful.
Any other contributors?
Yeah, Maria Firmina dos Reis, the novelist, had a diary which she wrote about her passion for her female friends in some ways that are not. I think the diary was censored by her stepsons. So some pages were ripped off, but you can see that she made poetry and wrote thoughts and feelings about women. It's very clear. I was working more deeply in this subject, and I will publish the diary with this essay. But I should do. I was supposed to do that now, but I start to write another book about another Black women. So I put this in the future, maybe next year. I will present more comprehensive essay about the Maria Firmina dos Reis homosexuality. But it's very interesting how she was able to talk about that in her diary in the middle 19th century until the beginning of the 20th in Amazon. So it's something. She was very, she was pioneering many fields, I think.
Thank you. We'll look out for that publication. That sounds exciting. If anyone else, any of the other contributors or editors have other names for Hope to look up or books, please do drop that in the chat so that they have that there to refer back to. I see a question from Laura Wexler.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this inspiring, exciting work. I've ordered the book. I haven't read it yet, but I can't wait. And it's wonderful to hear you speak about the collaborative process, which is very timely right now, I think. People are discovering, just because we have tools now also that can make this easier. But I'm interested also in the temporality of your feminism, because it's also very moving to me to hear you forthrightly claim this as a feminist project. And you've claimed it as a feminist project a lot because it's collaborative. But I'm wondering what else it is that is a feminist project about it. And it's moving to me because the history of being able to claim something as a feminist project goes up and down. I'm happy. It makes me really happy. But I also wonder what you mean by that makes you able as a group and individually to be so confident that it's good to claim this as a feminist project. More recently, at least in work that I do, it hasn't always been good to claim something as feminism. So what is it that's inspiring about the feminism as well as the collaboration? Thank you for your answer.
Thank you. Would our editors like to hop in?
I will. I mean, I would say, Laura, thank you for that question. That's really, that's very thoughtful. And I would say, for me, part of what makes it a feminist project is simply centering women in discussions about what freedom is and how it is defined and how individuals define it. Not freedom as, I think, as Erica said at the beginning, the ability to vote, the ability to own property, but how individuals on the ground define it and seek it for themselves, and how that is a gendered prospect. So I would say part of what makes it feminist is that it is centering the idea of freedom on women, which is, I think, radical still for historians to do. And secondly, and this goes back to like a older sort of 1970s, 1980s feminist project in history, which was about recovery. I mean, part of what many of our authors do are recover the stories of women from fragments, stories that have been lost, but they're able to recover them. I think we have the tools of recovering them in such a way that one can present a snippet of a life, a portrait of a life, and that recovery is still part of feminist history. I mean, it seems like an older version of it, but I think it's still important that we do that kind of recovery, and we capture and present voices that otherwise would just be hidden and unknown to us. And those stories of ordinary women, right, seeking seeking redress through the courts, for instance, deserve to be known as part of how we define freedom. And so for those reasons, it makes this a feminist project. Thanks.
Thank you. Do we have other questions? Well, I have a question. And my question is about the category woman. The category woman is acknowledged as a category in every single one of these biographies. And many, many, many elements change from biography to biography. But that's one thing that the work isn't necessarily challenging outright as a category. Did you come up against working with any of your contributors, different ways to define the category woman? And if not, was it a hard and fast rule that you wanted women and you were gonna use that category to anchor? I have the power of the spotlight, so I will just start spotlighting. I'll just start spotlighting editors. There we go.
I'll start by saying we had no hard and fast rules, right? We were absolutely open and not at all sure what we were going to necessarily find. We knew the questions that we wanted to ask. We had these kind of larger goals of kind of blowing up certain perceptions and boundaries and rules, and then we let the conversations kind of unspool and happen as they did. So I'll start there with that and see if Terri and Tatiana wanna jump in.
I'll say that I am probably among the audience and all the contributors and all the authors, the least theoretically inclined. So I tend to not think about categories. So but I understand that it is a very important historical process that we all do, right? To think about categories or not. They exist even though we might not grapple with them. So I'm gonna let Terri talk more about it.
Thank you, Tatiana. I don't know that I have actually much more to say. It's true. I don't think we had any hard or fast rules about it. Those that the category sort of was presented by the authors, and we didn't try to constrain it or necessarily expand it either. Okay. So, right, that problematizing that category is probably not the strongest contribution of our work. Yeah, I think we're trying. Well, I'll leave it at that.
And I'll add one more thing, and this may be what, like, this was something that was at the forefront of our mind that maybe perhaps constrained the work at the end of the day, right? But it was something that we were trying to work through, and that was the issue of pardus, right? The way that slavery in perpetuity works, and the way it passes through women's bodies, right? So insofar as we were interested in thinking both about the gender dimensions of the institution of slavery as well as the experiences of women, folks on the ground, and how we connected that to the gendered experience of emancipation, that might be, working through that problem might also be seen as a constraint, but not one that we necessarily intended to place on the manuscript, on the book as a constraint, but something we wanted to grapple with.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat, and from Michelle McKinley, and it's actually about teaching. So I want to actually throw this to the editors first, because as is often the case with these kinds of projects, you have to write some kind of pedagogical statement or some way that you see it, you know, in regards to other similar projects. But ways that the work can be used to teach. What ways did you have in mind going into the project? And then I'll open it up to contributors. If one or two of you want to speak up about ways that you think your piece could be used effectively in the classroom. I, of course, see many, many, many possibilities for this book. So if any of my students are on here, get ready. But yeah, so what about teaching? What about bringing this to students into the classroom?
Okay, all right, I'll go first. Yeah, well, I mean, part of what our vision for the book was to make it a teachable book. But without, I don't know that we necessarily thought that someone would like assign this book and teach all 24, but that was another reason to make the 5 questions consistent across all the chapters, so that if one uses it in a classroom, theoretically students will sort of hit those themes of how does one claim freedom, what are the obstacles, and how is the big question of how is freedom defined. They'll come through those in each essay. I mean, I think my vision was more for teaching it in a women's history class and in a comparative women's history class, to use sort of the biographies to jump across time and across place, comparatively in that way. I'll let Tatiana or Erica take it from here.
So I conceived of the book as something that could be taught in a wide variety of classes. My goal was that it wouldn't only be for classes that were about women's history or that were about slavery. I think there are many more classes across the United States now where the name is being changed from the history of slavery to the history of slavery and freedom. And that's something that I think our book speaks to, that you can't really continue to only think about slavery as like the legal institution, but to think about its opposite, and how the maintenance of slavery also helped in maintaining the freedom of those who had property. So I wanted to and will teach this book in my class about global slavery. And for that, it was important for me to include maps and to include other visuals that are always helpful for my students to be able to visualize the different places that are mentioned in the book. So that's something that I emphasized for the authors and many of the authors came on board with that, with the idea that maps are one of the ways that undergraduates especially are able to think through a story, is by visualizing where it happened. And just before we came on board, Chloe Ireton, who wrote the first chapter, she just emailed and said, Tatiana, I can't make it, but I wanted you to know that my students at University College London, where she is, have really been enjoying and being inspired by these women's stories. And the idea that young women will feel empowered by reading these biographies is something that makes the work worthwhile. That in and of itself, that it would empower young women to think more deeply about how they're claiming freedom in their own lives as we continue to grapple with political overtures, especially, well, not especially in the United States, but maybe so, the ongoing process by which the government tries to control women's bodies. I think that that's something that is an important contribution of the book.
I'll just add that I sneakily taught 2 of the chapters last semester while the book was still in press. I taught Tanya Banks's chapter on Elizabeth Key, and Chloe Ireton's chapter on Margareta de Sosa in a one semester African American history survey class, the students were absolutely into it, and these are first year and second year students. It's a lower division class, and they were what they liked about it, it sort of ranged from, wow, these are real people. This is not just sort of a large kind of a macro history, but they liked the idea of these micro histories, these stories of individuals, and individuals who are agents and actors and movers, right? That was really inspiring to them. The idea that slavery as an institution developed in a moment and changed over time and manifested in different ways across space, but there are also similarities. That was, and when you're first introduced to the subject, one might think of it in the United States as something that was fully formed, circa 18, in its 1850 form, right? So this was exciting and inspiring and interesting, but they were also fascinated by the work, like the work of getting at these stories, kind of the archival work that's required, and the questions that are asked, and then the stories that could be told. So that was really those were two really good class sessions, and I think that the volume as a whole will work in that kind of class and many others.
Well, that's certainly the behind the scenes sort of story we love to have on Slavery Archive Book Club about sneakily teaching essays before they're released, exclusives for the students in your courses. Honor, did you want to hop in on this question?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I think that one of the real areas in which this student can find this collection useful is with regards to the vast array, like, as an archival project, right? Is as Erica was just saying, and as I think Jessica Johnson sort of asked earlier about, the different kinds of freedom. There's so many different approaches to subjects in this book that you could sort of, introduce students to, a real spectrum of ways to do history, ways to interpret sources, ways to enter archives and work with spare materials. So I think as an archival project and as an example of really creative uses of limited sources, I think students could really respond to that. So.
Thank you. And it looks like in the chat, Margaret Newell adds, resistance is also a theme that students can connect with. These women claimed freedom against enormous obstacles. They changed personal histories and larger histories. And so I think that's getting at the kind of the micro history piece here that really can resonate. Thank you, Tatiana, for saying something I thought of as I was reading the book, is that, this should be a text in across an array of types of history courses, that you can introduce themes and topics with a very relatively brief biography is actually super useful in the case of students. We have another question from Hope. Hope, do you want to go ahead and chime in?
Yeah. Actually, before I ask my question, I would love to say that I love how Tatiana put it, because she was talking about how young women today still want to, try to communicate with someone, and they want to know that we can still fight for freedom. And I was thinking about how here in the South, we are still fighting for freedom for gay rights. We still have a huge problem with it. And so that's why I'm excited to read this book, because it's something that we can connect with. I don't know if anybody on here is from around Alabama area, but it's pretty much how it is down here. But the question I was wanting to ask is, how did all of you guys pick the specific time period that you chose? Like, what drew you to that time period?
And do you mean for the collection, or do you mean each of their historical specialties?
I'm kind of interested in both. Like, what specifically, why did they choose the people that they chose? And then why did they choose, what they wanted to, specialize in?
Okay. That's a really good set of questions. What was the selection process like for each of the women highlighted in the volume? Was that something you left up to the authors, or did you reach out to the authors about a particular individual that you hoped would be included? And then yourselves, what brought you to this work?
Well, no, we did not pick the women at all. We picked the brilliant historians and literary critics and interdisciplinary scholars who are in the book. We picked them, and we picked the periodization, right? We said from the earliest moments of African slavery in the Americas to the 19th century. And I think it was Kathleen who pushed us to go into the early 20th. So thank you for that, Kathleen, to really kind of encompass how people of African descent were memorializing and problematizing the history of slavery and freedom in the United States in her case. So it was our brilliant women historians who found their subjects. And so I think it would be, for them to speak on how they came to that particular person.
Thank you. And Hope's question was also a question that someone else in the chat had, so that takes care of both questions. Erica, did you have something you wanted to add? I saw maybe a slight gesture towards it. I just don't want to skip over you if you did.
Oh, okay. I was just going to, I was noticing Hope's trajectory in the chat, and that you're new to history. Is that correct, Hope?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. All right.
It is,
Great.
I'm on my second bachelor's.
Okay.
I started as CJ, but I got run over, so I can no longer pursue CJ.
Okay.
And I have no clue how I ended up with such a passion for history, but here I am.
Okay. And I would just say that, like, sometimes like that, we back our way into a project. If I reach back to my undergraduate years, I did not intend to major in history. It just sort of happened over time. I realized that those were the courses I was drawn to and connected with the most, and tended to my aptitude and my interest aligned there. And I think sometimes that happens when you're doing this kind of historical work. Like there's another phase in that, right? You find your subjects by there are happy accidents sometimes. And I think Chloe Ayrton's piece on Margareta de Sosa is an example of one of those kind of interesting developments, right? The narrative unspooled, and here you have in that particular chapter a story in a woman's own voice about her movement, her forced movement from Portugal over to this hemisphere. But you also have her a divorce proceedings, right? Her effort to liberate herself from a terrible husband, right? And you have a surrounding kind of Inquisition case as the folder that all of these stories are contained in, and sometimes stories reveal themselves to you as you're in the archive. So just as you're moving your way along in this path and finding out where you want to go, sometimes the work of history unspools in the same kind of a way, and then you find this embarrassment of riches, and you make something cool out of it.
And I'll just add quickly, welcome to Women's and Gender History Land. However you end up here, we're happy to have you. So thank you so much for joining and chiming in tonight. We have another question that's actually kind of along the lines of methodology and happy accidents, but also the challenges that come from researching women in the past. And so this question comes from Livia Tiede, and asks, are any biographies based on indirect primary sources of women that were not literate, for example? In the case of sources authored by men, how would a feminist perspective be conveyed? And the question of sources is always a question that comes up whenever you're looking at women in the past. And for authors, our contributors who are out there too, if you would like to speak specifically to this, but how do you deal with the sources you have? And for that matter, the sources you don't have, which is often the case in women's history.
I'll just give a quick answer to start. I know most of the sources that I read are always the voices of people who are illiterate, because I know a lot of people know this from the fields that they do, but for those who don't, because of course these are taken from verbal court testimonies spoken out loud that a scribe took down the information. So I think at least anybody who's doing this for Latin America under Spanish and Portuguese rule, that's going to be the norm, right? So it's a verbal statement, and it's interesting, of course, because the scribe is writing it out in a different way. I mean, obviously, it's a really complex process that many of you know, but is writing it out and then and shaping it and whatnot. But we still believe that we can get to some kind of a kernel of truth there by thinking about how the narratives are used and how sort of standardized narratives might intersect with people's actual more unique individual experiences. I mean, that's what I always think about. Like, the more you know what a standard kind of rhetoric is expected within any given type of case, the more you really understand what's expected. And then the more you realize, you see like divergences from the expected narrative or rhetoric, then you're starting to get to something, a real, jewel or kernel of truth. That's always something that I enjoy.
Yeah, and so I wrote about Hannah Manana McKenney in 17th century Bermuda, and so all of the sources were indirect, right? And because it's English sources and these weren't extended court cases, there's no record of verbal testimony. And so for her life, it was really thinking about, there's a record of a bill of sale, and there was a list of her mother on a manifest of enslaved people, owned by the proprietary company. And so it was really thinking about what those literal scraps revealed of her actions, and then thinking about the relationships in her life. And so she and her husband are able to get their freedom. They go to the Bahamas. And so in the Bahamas, it was genealogical records, right? And I wasn't able to travel, so I had to rely on these published genealogical records. And so it's really thinking about what are all the experiences and connections that lie behind, these imperial records.
Thank you. Honor, did you want to hop in?
Yeah, it was Sophie. I think Sophie had her hand up ahead of me.
Oh, Sophie, go ahead.
I'll let you have the stage first.
Thank you, Anna. This is truly collaborative. I wanted to say that rather like Nicole, I work on French Louisiana, and I work on oral testimony given in court as well. And there it was also because I worked on it on my book, but having to really get into how they actually wrote it down. And so they would write it in the scribe would write it in shorthand. Then they would go off and produce a longhand version, which they would read back to the deponent, who would get to change things or not. And they'll fix things. You'll see it in the text, no, it said this, or scratch something out. But one of the things that's so interesting is that French convention for writing it down, they turn it into the third person. doing it really quickly, turn it into the third person. But when you read the testimony, you'll find moments when it slips into dialogue and it goes from, and it's so, once you start seeing it, the pattern is everywhere. So the convention is third person, but then it'll be, and then I said to him, don't you come here, and you see the first person, or the, you know, and the figures of speech and Creole. And so it's just jumps out at you in terms of the liveliness. Highly problematic sources, of course, but I think to do that sort of literary analysis is so valuable. And I wanted to say also to the question of, you know, I think probably many of us grapple with who do we write, which person do we choose to write about, because there were different possibilities. And I really want to say something, to go back to the process of this editorial team and these questions, and both because it was so helpful. The flexibility was flexible in terms of, I think, especially for me, working on having to think about what is a legal definition of freedom. And we're so shaped by what happens in the 19th century with terms like emancipation, or even terms like manumission, but they don't apply in the same way in these different legal regimes. And the French one, it's super hard to get manumitted. And so then, you know, for me, thinking about freedom was actually not legal freedom. How could an enslaved woman practice freedom? And did she even think of it that way? And how gendered was it in terms of, you know, she becomes an entrepreneur and she's running a business. She's a ringleader. But she can't go from one settlement to another. She has to send men because it would be too noticeable. So, you know, in all of these ways it's gendered, but that flexibility in that process and your questions and the framing it was just really phenomenal. And I think I probably speak for most of the contributors. I mean, it helped me rethink other aspects of my other research as well. And that's just such a gift that you gave us all. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead on.
Yeah, okay. Oh, well, I just wanted to speak to this question about, you know, sources, and because, you know, I'm really grateful to the editors for letting me do what I ultimately did in this chapter that I contributed. You know, the people that I focused on were a mother and a daughter, and they're part of a much bigger project of this family that sued for freedom, claiming indigenous ancestry, and it spans, you know, from the 17th century to the 19th century. And when they first approached me about contributing something, I had not written a word of this book at all. So I assumed that I was going to do something from the 19th century because there was just more stuff. You know, there was like the documents were more complete and there was more written, you know, the testimony had full case files and that sort of stuff. But when I actually started writing the book, you know, and then they started harassing me about due date. You know, I realized, you know, that I was in the 18th century. I was with the first case, and there's like so little to go on. But, you know, because I had to produce something, I kind of leaned into what I had. And rather than sort of focusing on words, which is, you know, kind of what we do as historians, I sort of tried to experiment with space and looked at maps. And I was actually really excited about the mapping part of this project, but I just started looking at maps and relationships of where families lived, and in some ways sort of started to work with that to come up with much I thought, you know, a much more sort of complex understandings of the community in which these freedom suits emerged, from which these freedom suits emerged. And I don't think I probably would have done that had I just sort of stopped where I was and gone to, you know, the easy sources, the written sources. You know, you know, the editors really encouraged me to sort of lean into this spatial analysis of how litigation emerged informally and then formally within the courts, you know, to sort of do this backstory. So I was very grateful to them for allowing that opportunity.
Thank you. Erica.
I apologize. You're probably maybe hearing some nursery rhymes. My 14-month-old is in the background. If you are, I apologize. But I just wanted to speak a little bit on the source material and what that was like for me to really encounter my topic and my subject, which was Maria Remedios de Valle, who is, today considered the mother of the nation, and the nation being Argentina. And what I found fascinating when I collaborated with Florencia Guzman, who's written about her previously, was the source material that we have on her is court testimonies from white officers. And that just kind of blew me away, that and it's such an exceptional case, but it was their willingness to advocate for her and to ensure that she actually received her pension. And it's through recounting her heroic acts on the battlefield that's how we learned about what she did and how she was able to survive. And so in many ways, I think it's definitely an exceptional story, but the fact that you have then again in the 19th century these white officers, and that's the testimony that we use to really understand who she was, why she even went to battle, the torture that she endured, all of which they recount in their narratives in order to make sure that, and she does eventually get her pension. So it was definitely, it was an interesting experience to have to see that it was their testimony, white men, to be able to come forth with that truth. And today, like I said, we celebrate her more, and she did get the nickname of being a mother of a nation while on the battlefield. And today she's, remembered every year. November 8th is the Day of Afro-Argentines.
Thank you. Other questions? Kathleen, go ahead.
So I don't have a question. I was going to talk about the source answer as well, in part because I'm going to have to run in a minute. What was just so fabulous about being part of this volume, and especially going to the conference panels, was hearing about all of the really wonderful scholarly work that people were doing to find the women's stories. And, as you heard from a couple of folks earlier, just these little scraps that people were working with or on or thinking about, right, space and looking at maps. And so my piece is the last piece in the volume, and I'm writing about a woman who was a poet in the late 19th and early 20th century. And so kind of felt like I had an embarrassment of riches in that I had so much from in her own voice, though again, there are so many silences. She doesn't have an archive necessarily. But she managed to publish 2 books of poetry in her lifetime, one of which her granddaughter republished in the 1970s. Her name was Carrie Williams Clifford. And then the digitization of newspapers, and especially of African-American newspapers, has been really key, because she wrote for newspapers as well. And so really had an opportunity to read her own words. Where it was a little hard for me as a historian was also then to think about, okay, I have these 2 books of poetry that she published. And so kind of how to take that kind of a source, right, a literary source, and think through, what to say about her ideas about freedom. And for me, much of her poetry was almost autobiographical. She would write poems about events she was living through, or poetry about past historical moments. And so she was clearly grappling with history, and African-American women's history in particular, and kind of celebrating Black women in the past and the present for her. And then also in this moment in the late 19th century in the United States, when the history of the Civil War and of slavery is being rewritten in really racist ways to kind of celebrate slavery. And so for me as a historian, it was really delightful to watch her coming up with a way to write about Black women's history and think about how women like Phyllis Wheatley had written and then what she was doing. So again, it just, the wide range of sources in this volume is part of what made it so much fun.
Thank you. Thanks for chiming in. And in the chat, Livia adds, your sources add a lot to my understanding of this wonderful book. Thank you very much. I needed this book. I feel like I definitely also had those same feelings reading the book as well. I want to toss it over to Alex, who has a question. I think more for the editors, but could probably also be answered by some of our contributors as well. Alex?
Yeah, I was blown away by that graph and beginning in the introduction. I'm going to, I don't know if everybody can see it right there, but this right away, it blew my mind. It was like, because it accomplishes exactly what you set out to do, which is to shift the question of freedom onto women, right? Which is what I've heard come up over and over again as one of the goals, right? And this is how the book, in a way, kind of like at least changes what we can think about history of this period. And that graph is doing a lot of that work just in one graph, and it's of course it's just almost in passing compared to the rest of the wonderful work, and it's so much different as a genre than the biography. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about, who came up with that graph and what's the story behind the graph? Because it's doing a lot of the work also the biographies are doing, but in a completely different register, right? It kind of just like, so freedom is not, this masculinist notion of freedom necessarily. And here's this graph that also communicates that. So a little bit, if you could say a little bit more about the history of that powerful visualization.
So I'll speak to that, and thank you, Alex, for liking it. So the image, for those of you who don't have the book in front of you, is called Periods Between the Abolition of Slavery and Women's Suffrage. And as we kind of captioned it, the timeline illustrates why African descended women had to protect and speak up for their communities in a range of ways. For women, citizenship remained constrained by patriarchal definitions of political capacity well into the 20th century. So what the illustration is by country, by the different nation states in which these women lived. It was when abolition happened, when men were freed for the most part, and in some places got the right to vote, right to own property. And then the end date is when in these countries women got the right to vote, which we associate most strongly with what emancipation is, right? To have political representation, to have a voice in government. And so, in most of the Americas, all of the Americas, this happens in the 20th century. And in many places, while women got the right to vote, it was white women of property, not African descended women or indigenous women, who for the most part in many countries are still completely disenfranchised. So what does freedom mean when the political system does not represent you as a human being, when you cannot have a say in your political process? So that's what we aim to do in that chart. And I wanted it to be an easy way to explain to students the significance of what it means to have a gendered experience of freedom, when so much of the historiography has always focused on emancipation means that men can then be part of that freed men can then be part of the political process, when that was just so not the case for freed women.
Thank you. I was blown away by the graph too. It really pulled me into the book and what you were all conceptualizing in a really different way. It was really, really helpful. I'm going to throw it over to Anna now to ask a question that she has for you all.
Okay, I have two questions. The first question is about a topic that we had a number of times, a theme that returns a number of times. That is the issue of this fragmentary histories of women. Then all of those who are trying to write histories, especially of Black women and enslaved women. And here in the book, you go as far as then you go to a very early period when perhaps it's even more difficult to build a narrative that is composed of fragments. I ask myself if through this book, which is a collective biography, but if it was a biography of one of these women, perhaps, or if some of you were writing biographies of several women on in a specific place or a specific period, perhaps this project would be even more challenging. I am thinking here, for example, about this new graphic novel that Rebecca Hall is going to publish, and is the title is Wake, and the subtitle, now that I don't know by heart, is about the hidden history of participation of women in slave revolts. And it's about her trajectory trying to write about women in slave revolts. And essentially she has, in the graphic novel at least, she has to give up. And with this kind of book, you don't need to give up. But perhaps if this was a book of a single author, it would be very challenging. Then my question first would be, what this book here, did this book here changes our way of writing these histories of enslaved women from these fragments? This is one question. And the second question would be how this book transformed the work that you are already doing, because I know that Erica, Terri, and Tatiana, they are working on topics that are very different in different geographical areas. Does this book have any impact on the work that you are doing individually as scholars in terms of individual projects? And perhaps, I don't know if anybody among the participants, they have the authors who contribute to the book, if they have any thoughts to say about that, because many of us, I think that we have this sort of anxiety about projects like this that will be built from these fragments, and perhaps we are simply wrong because of this big emphasis on the silences, on the absence of information in archives that deal with these women. This book contradicts that, but it is still fragmentary. Then do we have a new light now with that?
Well, if I could speak first, I would like to say that there has been, to my mind, an overemphasis on fragments, especially for people who work, at least from what I can speak of, in the areas claimed by either Spain or Portugal, who had this incredible bureaucracy and produced endless amounts of documentation. If you're working in any of these regions, we have too much documentation, right? We have so much documentation that we need many more historians who please can join us to write these, to write the many histories that haven't been written. Incredibly lengthy court cases from all kinds of tribunals and many, many other sources. And so for me, it's always been a matter of assuaging students' fears when they think that they can't possibly write about this one thing that they want to write about. And I'm there telling them, you can indeed write about that. All that it will require is this amount of patience for you to like sit in archives and read endlessly, right? Until you then are able to find what you are looking for and be creative and write those histories. So that's my thing about fragments. I think it does depend on the geographical region and the periodization of your work. I am writing a book that has a bunch of microhistories, and to write one paragraph I've read 20 documents, and so I think it is very much possible to reach women's and the histories of people who you might think didn't leave a record, but yes, they did.
I'll jump in, and I'll add. First, I'll say I'm in awe of folks like you, Tatiana and Terri, and so many of our authors who work in the earlier period. I feel like I haven't easy as somebody who works in the 19th century when I think of but at the same time we grapple with similar issues in terms of fragments and in terms of where the sources might be, like who might be the person who's telling the story, right? And so I would say that yes, as you just said, even though the sources are limited, if you approach them with the right mindset, there's a wealth of material to work with. We just have to be willing to continue to ask questions, and maybe ask slightly different questions, and maybe shift things around a little, like keep working at it. Sometimes we have to fill in the silences with other voices. Sometimes we have to think as robustly as we can about the context, and sometimes we have to use the may have been or the might have been when we can't get to a definitive answer, right? But all of those things all of those approaches help to fill in a life story. I mean, I just a couple of weeks ago published a brief biography of Madam C.J. Walker, a 20th century, a woman who was born in 1867, but left a lot of source material that's rooted in the last 10 years of her life. So once she becomes a famous hair care pioneer and businesswoman, there are a ton of business records to work with. But not only is there not a wealth of evidence about the early years of her life, she also worked to obscure the early years of her life because she had a public image to uphold, right? So that requires asking different kinds of questions of the materials that you have to kind of sketch out the life. And other people continue to build on that. So it's possible. It's difficult, but it's possible, and it's invigorating work. So.
Terri, go ahead.
Thanks. I'll jump in here too. Yeah, one of the questions you asked, Anna, was about transformation. And I think especially as the contributors talked about their work, I think they do provide so many really rich models for how you do history when you have fragmentary evidence and when you have evidence that's more abundant. And so, I mean, I do think the book is transformational in that regard. And I also would say that one of the things we feel like the volume challenges other historians to do is to know that there are stories and there are fragments out there. As Erica said, when there are only fragments, how do you piece them together? Do you think about it spatially as like Honor Sachs does or Alice Baumgartner does? How do you create a story in that regard? But I think it challenges young scholars to know that there are stories that can be told, and this book provides models for doing that. I think the other thing that I'd want to say and add in reference to my own work, and we see a little bit of this in the volume where I'm thinking of Jacqueline's work and Maria Helena Kelly Carter Jackson. A number of our authors connect to how, and Nicole talked about this as well a little while ago, how their subjects are now being remembered or are present in modern history. So there's a public memory of some of these figures. Erica Edwards talked about that as well. Also, I think we should, in my own work, I'm not dealing so much with public memory as these authors and Anna does, but rather descendant communities are another, that doesn't show up in our volume as much, but I think that's another way in which we help to reconstruct the stories of individuals and families is through living descendants. And that's sort of part of my work today that I'm very excited about, and I find it invigorating as well.
Thank you. Michelle, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, I was just sort of going to pick up on some of the things that Tatiana was saying, but there's also, in terms of the archival sources that we use, I work a lot with parish records and working across different kinds of marriage, death, birth, those kinds of records. And so they're fragments, but then it takes a while to put it all together. And Tatiana is right. We do have an abundance if you are working in, 17th, 16th century, the Iberian world. But what's interesting is how one person can construct their own archive, right? So in the subject that I wrote about, and I tend to write a lot about nuns, just because they leave such a prolific record. But what I was able to do was to piece together her life, just going through different archives, just in search of her biography. And that was something that I was not planning on doing before the editors contacted me. So I was really happy to be able to do that. But, just saying that we have a lot of material doesn't mean that it gives us the full biography, and you really do have to be tenacious about figuring out where people are at certain times.
Thank you. Yeah, I think tenacious is maybe one of the best descriptors for this whole project, but it does really require a tenaciousness, or I guess it was a force of will, Tatiana said earlier. Margaret, did you want to hop in?
Sure. I was also going to answer the question and talk a little bit about my experiences writing about Sarah Trockham, who was Native American, African American person who was trafficked, a free person who was trafficked into slavery. So with indigenous slavery, or people illegally enslaved, there's even there's an effort not to create an archive around these events. So it's creates its own sorts of challenges. But I guess I want to say a couple things about the fragmentary evidence question. I think anyone working in the colonial period in British America or English America, all stories are fragmentary. So anyone writing almost any kind of history is facing the questions of fragment. So it is not just a question that affects women's and gendered history. I actually really appreciated here's also an answer to the question about collaboration and how this project changed our work. I actually really appreciated the ways in which the editor's questions helped shape my storytelling. I had a very limited fragment. I really had nothing that was even a transcription of this woman's voice. So no deposition even. It was just a court case, a series of court cases, and some bills of sale and purchase that came up in these court cases in which her identity had been changed from a biracial person to a person of African descent, and therefore legally enslavable in the colony in which she was originally enslaved. So trying to be a storyteller of that was challenging, but I really appreciate the way the editors, posed the questions and encouraged me to be a storyteller. I filled in a lot of the gaps by just talking about other people that might be her, that had lives that were similar to hers, if they weren't her, just trying to identify
other fragmented stories that might actually fill in the gaps in her biography. And if they didn't, they still told us something about what, this granular experience of this person might have been. And I also appreciated the way the editor's questions sort of made me start thinking about community and connections, and chances to talk about how information might have been transmitted within larger communities. And I hadn't really thought about situating her in community in the way that they were suggesting I do. So I thought that was very helpful, because she ended up suing for reparations successfully. And it's sort of a unique case in that respect. So that's a way in which, the editors, the collaboration, the questions really helped achieve storytelling in ways that I think I might not have if I hadn't participated in this volume in the same way.
Thank you. Thank you so much for chiming in and sharing, and also sharing the way that you were writing kind of a collection of biographies to form a biography in a collective biography. The ways that these women's connections, that's one thing that comes across is connection throughout the volume. It is, believe it or not, time to wind down, and you all, I hope, are keeping an eye on the chat, where there are lots and lots of congratulations and positive comments and thank yous from folks who have their hands on the book, who are planning to use the book, who are planning to talk about the book in their courses or use it in their own work. I know that I will come back to it time and again, not just my students, but for myself. In the review I wrote, I talked a lot about possibility and how one who maybe wasn't familiar with histories of African descended women could easily think a number of current events are impossible. And yet that real continuity and connection that we get, particularly by the end of the volume, into nearly the 20th century, really does speak to the ways that the volume and the work that you all did is present. The people in the book are making all kinds of archival ways out of no way, are sifting through boxes and boxes to deliver these really wonderful, wonderfully rendered histories. So if you do not have it, go out there and get it, order it, where fine books are sold. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you to our editors and our contributors for generously speaking up and answering our questions. Just a quick highlight, because the Slavery Archive Book Club Hit Parade doesn't stop. We just announced next year, because that's where we are. We've got a whole nother year coming your way. So please go to Slavery Archive, our website, and check out both what we have left in store for you this year and what's coming up beginning this summer. The next time we will meet will be Saturday, March 13th from 1 to 3 p.m. Eastern to look at an archive of taste, race, and eating in the early United States with the book's author, Lauren Klein. And I'll pop the registration link and that title into the chat real quick. I think I did it. Nope, I didn't. I can do this. It can happen. We're living in the future. Oh, thank you, Alex. Thanks for the support. So we'll go ahead and you can go ahead and get yourself registered for our next book on the Slavery Archive Book Club. Thank you all so much for joining us, and have a wonderful evening. Bye.